guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is retired U.S. Marine Corps Infantry Major Scott Huesing. He is a veteran of Operations Desert Storm, Iraqi Freedom, and Enduring Freedom. He is also the author of the gripping new book, Echo in Ramadi, the first-hand story of U.S. Marines in Iraq's deadliest city. And Major Huesing, thanks so much for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me on the program. It's a pleasure to be here, Greg.
Well, let's start at the very beginning. Where were you born and raised, and when did you join the service?
Well, I grew up in Illinois, in the north suburbs of Chicago, and went to high school at City of Waukegan. And after a not-so-stellar high school career, decided to enlist in the Marines. I got roped in like most young Marines do, and was very enamored by the whole glitz and glamour of the Marine Corps. And I led a pretty risky lifestyle growing up. Rode a motorcycle, ran from the cops, got my share of fights, and met the Marines. And they seemed like this great big group of risk takers, and I figured these guys are perfect. They're a perfect fit for me. And I enlisted, did 4 years, kind of figured out the error of my ways, and decided I needed to get a college education, and went to Illinois State University, and I graduated in 3 years. And I tell people that because I attribute that success in college, Greg, to the fact that the discipline I learned as a young Marine, what that organization does for young people, especially those who may have steered off course a little bit with limited supervision, I think is irreplaceable. And I attribute all my success to that. I got my commission as an infantry officer, and at 24 years and after 10 deployments and traveling to over 60 different countries, and it was an amazing journey. And I was either a Marine or leading Marines the entire time, which I'm extremely proud to say.
Two quick follow-ups. You're from the northern suburbs. I assume you're a Cubs fan.
I am a Cubs fan.
Good man.
Correct.
Good man.
Not a huge sports fan, but I will go for the Cubs.
Why the Marines?
I joined the Marines just because they were the first ones that got their claws into me, I think. Honestly, I knew nothing about the military. I knew nothing about what went on in the Marine Corps other than the good-looking uniforms they wore, and the office of the recruiters I went to was painted camouflage, and there was camouflage netting over the desks, and I thought, these guys are where I need to be.
They meant business.
They did, yeah. They were all business.
Desert Storm. You mentioned this in the introduction to the book. Obviously, a relatively brief military operation, but explain what unit you were with then and what your role was.
Yeah, so when I was a young enlisted Marine, and we got orders to fight in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, everyone was very excited, as most young Marines are, because it had been since Vietnam, since Panama, maybe Grenada, those brief punctuated conflicts, where we knew we were going to a full-on war, and we were very excited to fight. And it wasn't the grand scale of battle that I experienced later on in my career. And as I write, I don't say this to diminish the service, but it was over so quickly. It was almost a very forgettable experience because we pushed through so rapidly. The surrender occurred. But the Marines that I fought alongside, I still keep in touch with them to this day. I was on the phone with one just this morning who's congratulating me on the book success for Echo in Ramadi. And it's a very unique brotherhood. And we were very proud of our service. But that operation, Desert Shield and Desert Storm, was very pale in comparison to future combat deployments that I experienced, where the intensity of the fighting was much heavier. The level of kinetics, where we were bringing the full weight of the military to bear, and the fact that we were doing it in an urban environment made it vastly different than what I experienced as a young guy in Desert Shield and Desert Storm.
After Desert Storm, is that when you moved from enlisted to officer?
Yes. After Desert Storm, I had several months left on my contract, but I had started researching universities because I did want to get an education. I had some good leaders and mentors that said, Scott, you should look into this. And there was also a massive drawdown in the military at that time because we operate on this sine wave of post-war, pre-war, where the force numbers go up, and we had a force reduction, and there were some lat moves going on where they change you from one job to the next, and none of them seemed appealing to me. So I decided to get out, go to college, and I still stayed connected to the Marine Corps even in college when I was a machine gunner with weapons company in the Chicago area. So I still stayed connected, and then once I graduated, I got my commissioning program through the basic officer candidates class, and Greg, to be honest, I really fell into that one as well, and I had ambitions as a criminal justice science major working for the federal government. And again, there was a hiring freeze, but a young, motivated sergeant called me up and said, I have your package, Scott. We'd love it if you could go to OCS in January. And I didn't hesitate, and I'm so glad I made that decision because it was probably one of the best in my life.
At what point did you get put in charge of a company?
Well, I got put in charge of a company of Marines at the same time every other captain does. You go through several different levels of command. The Marine Corps entrusts only the very best to command young Marines, men and women in combat or in training. And they go through almost a year of their lives in preparatory school in Quantico, Virginia, before they're given that opportunity to step in front of a platoon Marines as that first step. And throughout that, they're assigned various levels of leadership with increased responsibility. And obviously, you prove yourself, you do well, but everyone has the same opportunities. And after you do several leadership billets and train yourself and show your potential for future leadership, then you're sent to follow-on schools and then selected to command at the company level. And that happens normally after you graduate from the Expeditionary Warfare School. And again, in Quantico, Virginia, they send you back and you're selected. Not everybody gets selected, though. I'm not going to say it's a 100% guarantee, but those that are selected, I think it's important to note for viewers and listeners that the young men and women that enlist right out of high school, like I did, you really don't see it, but now I have the perspective to understand that our military organizations, service-wide, they have the best leadership at every level, including those junior officers, all the way through general officers.
Well, let's talk about Echo and Ramadi. Echo refers to Echo Company, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines. When did you get the orders that you were headed to Iraq?
Well, when I left school, I actually had to graduate early. The battalion was on orders. They were going to deploy, and they needed to staff all the rifle companies with commanders so they would be at their full strength. So I didn't get to walk across the stage like all the other captains. I was shoved a diploma in my briefcase, said, hey, you got to go check in. So I packed my vehicle, left my wife in Virginia again, and then headed straight across country to Camp Pendleton from Virginia. I parked my Jeep in the parking lot. I checked in on a Wednesday, took command on a Friday, and then the next week we were in the high desert training for war. Shortly thereafter, we were on board the USS Boxer, WASP amphibious class ship, when the 15th Marine Expeditionary Commander, Colonel Brian Boudreau, stepped out on the 10th of November, the Marine Corps birthday, and told us that we just got official orders that the 15th ME was going into Iraq as part of the surge strategy that had just been ordered by President George W. Bush and General David Petraeus. So we stood there on the flight deck of the Boxer, bright sunny day, steaming ahead, and 2,000 Marines just let loose because, again, these are young guys. It's their first time, and they all had been training so hard for game day, and they were about to go into the Super Bowl of combat. So,
did you know you were headed to Ramadi at that point, or did those orders come later?
We knew we were going to Ramadi. The 15th MU itself was comprised of 2,500 Marines and sailors, and once we were pushed into the country of Iraq, they really farmed out the 15th MU. So some of the units went north. The aviation units were spread to Al-Assad and Camp Korean Village out to the west, part of Al-Anbar province. And then 2 infantry companies were sent to Ramadi to support the 1st Brigade combat team with the Ready First. And that was Echo Company, my company, and then Fox Company, which was commanded by a good friend of mine, John Smith. And we worked exclusively for the Army. And the reason they did that was because Iraq at the time, and for several years, was essentially a giant game of whack-a-mole. The insurgency and these hardcore fighters would pop up in cities like Tikrit, Fallujah, Ramadi, Najaf, and for years we had been hammering them back down into the ground. With success, we were definitely killing more of the enemy than they were of us, but we never had the ability to cover down on all those areas at once. So when the surge strategy was implemented it allowed the Army to take 2 rifle companies from the Marine Corps and add them to their strength. And we were bigger in size than traditional Army companies. We were about 200, 250 Marines, where the Army at the time had about 80 soldiers to 100 soldiers because they'd suffered a lot of attrition and they'd been there for so long. When we got into the city, it really allowed the Army to use this as a leverage to establish firm bases in the city, to gain and maintain security and a physical presence that they just hadn't been able to do. So as we went through and cleared entire sections of the city, the Army could come in and establish firm bases to which they could conduct future operations out of, establish local Iraqi police stations, Iraqi Army recruiting centers, and things that were designed to help future stability operations take root in that country.
Was that known as the clear and hold strategy? Was that the terminology used with the surge?
Clear and hold wasn't something that we doctrinally employed. We were conducting clearance operations. Our mission in Iraq in 2006 and 2007 was to kill or capture anti-Iraqi forces, and that's what we did. That was our whole mission.
When people hear cities like Fallujah, Ramadi, if you're not there and you don't have people in the service, the names kind of run together. What was unique about the challenges in Ramadi compared to what you knew was happening elsewhere?
Well, what's interesting about the city of Ramadi in itself, and it's interesting when general listeners or viewers hear the word like Ramadi. And when I wrote the book, and I was very insistent on that being the title, and there was a little bit of conversation. Well, no one's going to understand what Ramadi is. It's a strange word. It doesn't, and I kind of pitched it this way, because it was important for me to keep that title when I wrote Echo in Ramadi. Was people had never heard of Guadalcanal or places like Okinawa or Khe Sanh either until those books had been written and they'd become ingrained into our American culture. And that's why it's so important that people do learn that name. Our Ramadi, Iraq, it's the gray city. And Marines and soldiers died there. And they fought for not only the freedom of Iraq, but also to protect what we hold dear in this country. And it's one story that I absolutely didn't want it to be marginalized in the shadows of other great battles in Najaf or Baghdad or Fallujah that did get a lot of attention. And to this day, I still get emails and phone calls from a lot of the Marines, not even my Marines and soldiers that fought in Ramadi, thanking me for telling this story, because there's others written, but I don't think there's any written that are as detailed and as heartfelt with the emotion and the feeling that I was really lucky to get from my Marines and the families that told their stories that I shared in my writing in Echo in Ramadi.
Hold on right there. We'll be right back with Scott Huesing. The book is Echo in Ramadi. This is Veterans Chronicles. Welcome back to Veterans Chronicles on the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Corombos, honored to be joined in studio by Scott Huesing, retired U.S. Marine Corps infantry major and the author of Echo in Ramadi. And, sir, in reading this book, it's clear that one of your priorities here is not just explaining what happened, but who you were with. You spend a lot of time explaining who these guys were that were critical in various parts of the story, and unfortunately, in some cases, the ones that you lost. It seems like that was a bigger feature than I've seen in a lot of other books. Explain why that was so important to you.
Well, I think, Greg, if you want to learn about events and things, you pick up a newspaper, right? And what's important to me is not the material things, but it's about people and why they do things. Why are you crossing your legs like that? How did it feel? When you squeezed the trigger on the rifle, what were you thinking? To get that type of emotion from so many different perspectives, I think is very unique. And I think that's what people want to read about. And when I describe my Marines in Echo and Ramadi, it's them. I did 75 interviews with all of my Marines, and I would have loved to have told 250 stories, but nobody wants to read a book that long. So the stories that I told were very important, and I think they're also very emblematic of what not only every Marine in Echo Company experienced, but what all soldiers and Marines did, not only in Iraq or Afghanistan, but in any war. Because it's a cliche maybe, or a simple adage that war is timeless, but it really is. And there's distinctions and comparisons you can make, but I often get asked the question, how are your Marines better? And how did you understand that they were trained so well to be so effective at what they did, to suffer so few casualties, even though we did lose Marines? We did have dozens of Marines wounded. I think talking to my Vietnam veterans and Korean War veterans is that there's an understanding of the Arab culture, of the regional culture that our military has today that we prepare them for. And because of the fact that they know about that culture, I think it really set them up for success on the battlefield, because they were living in the city. We lived in the city amongst the people, where 90% of them were good, peace-loving Iraqis. And there was probably another 10% that were insurgents, 5% hardcore fighters, and then 5% that maybe just wanted to make a name for themselves. And they stood up and tried to fight us in Ramadi, and they lost badly on most days. But the fact that the Marines understood the culture and were able to interact with the people, it really was valuable. And I like to say this too, is that in comparison to other battles, you could say perhaps that the Battle of Ramadi was significant in the fact that, one, it was the capital city of Al-Anbar province, and two, it can be compared to maybe the Tet Offensive of Vietnam. We won Ramadi. Make no mistake about it. The Marines and the Army that fought in Ramadi, we won that city. We set the conditions in 2004, and then we pulled back, and then they had to retake it again in 06 and 07, and we did. And that's validated not only from our actions in that small fraction of time we spent there, but the Army, who was there well before we showed up and stayed long after we left. But they made me realize that we had made a difference together, the Marines and the Army, as this joint team. And what happened afterwards, by giving that city back to Iraq, they punted it through the grandstands of life. And I think we only need to look at our history books in May of 2015 to understand when ISIS began to rear its ugly head, what city did they take? Ramadi, because of its key terrain, significant importance with the government. It was no mystery. And none of us needed a crystal ball back then, Greg, to realize if we didn't plant a flag in this country, proverbially speaking, build a physical presence like we did from our past battles, and learn from our history like we did in the Pacific Theater, as we did in the European theater after World War II. If we didn't do that, we knew we'd be back there.
What was your reaction when, obviously, all the sacrifice you and your men and other Marines and other Army units put in to see what happened when ISIS came through there?
People ask me that question a lot. People ask my Marines that, and I don't think we sit around and pine about the blood we spilled or the Marines that gave every measure of devotion in their lives. I don't think that keeps us up at night, because we knew if we didn't stay there, it was going to fall again. It was just a matter of certainty. I think that what the Marines and the soldiers did in 2006 and 2007 in that city, they made a difference. And aside from killing a lot of the bad guys that needed to be killed, they also helped a lot of good people. And that's what Marines do. It's really the true spirit of what Marines do, is they help those that can't help themselves. And every time they're employed into combat or in a humanitarian role, that's what they do. And they always perform remarkably, and makes me extremely proud to have spent almost 25 years with that organization and be affiliated with them in every way. And I still am. And that's the beauty of this network, and the power of human connection, and the power of the military family, is that we still stay very connected.
Scott, we'll take another quick break here. Retired U.S. Marine Corps Infantry Major Scott Huesing. The book is Echo in Ramadi. We'll be right back on Veterans Chronicles. Welcome back to Veterans Chronicles on the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Corombos. Thanks for being with us. Our guest this week, retired U.S. Marine Corps Infantry Major Scott Huesing, veteran of Operations Desert Storm, Iraqi Freedom, and Enduring Freedom. And he's also the author of the new book, Echo in Ramadi, the first-hand story of U.S. Marines in Iraq's deadliest city. And Scott, I want to talk pretty much at length in this segment about the personal stories again, some of these guys that you talked about. And obviously, it started before you got to Iraq. I think it might have been in the story you talked about Libby, your squad leader, who unfortunately lost his life, and how at training, I think you might have been at 29 Palms, and you're just strolling through at night. He's got a bottle of something and offered you a drink, and it's just that kind of commitment to getting to know your guys that certainly struck me, and that struck a lot of readers as well. Talk about that process, taking the time to do that, and how that cohesion played out when you were at war.
Well, I often get asked the question, because I was prior enlisted, if that made me a better officer. And my answer is always the same, Greg. No, it didn't make me a better officer. I think it absolutely gave me a different perspective of what the young Marines were going through, how valuable their time was, and how I never wanted to misuse that time. And I also understood that being genuine and really connecting with those who is your privilege to lead. It's not a right. It's your privilege and quite an honor to be put in a position to do that, where you influence and impact so many lives. You never realize it at that time. And sometimes it takes 5 or 10 years and you get a phone call and they remind you of something you said. And that's a unique responsibility that you don't often think of. But developing relationships is really the most important thing about being a good leader. And that's not exclusive to me. I didn't invent any of that. But I've always been aware of that and tried to listen to the Marines. And although I'm sure there's times I could be accused of not being such a great listener, but circumstances dictate. But to be close to your Marines, to those you lead, is an important tenet of leadership. And it's not listed as a trait or principle of leadership, but compassion is on the top of my personal list, because you need to understand how things affect them and how they deal with things, how their personal lives matter, while still making the mission the number one priority. And if you do that, you're going to set yourself up for success as a leader. And there's a fine line. You don't want to be too familiar. I never say that I was good friends with my Marines. They've got enough friends. They've only got one commanding officer, and that's what I always made them realize. They got plenty of friends. But I was always approachable, and I always thought my place was with the Marines. And if there was gear to be moved, I was moving it. If there was a patrol, I was on it. If there was a firefight, I was in it. And I never wanted to task my Marines, order them to do things that I was not absolutely willing to do myself. And I know there's examples of people that do that. I wasn't one of them. But again, that's how I operated, and it's not just Scott Huesing. The majority of infantry officers, the majority of military officers, that's the tenet of leadership they subscribe to. Marines lead from the front in everything we do. We eat last, and we lead from the front. And it's just something so important to know the people you lead. And whether it's in corporate America or whether it's on the battlefield or in the military, it's a people business. You have to know your people to be successful. And that's one of the leadership lessons that comes through in Echo and Ramadi as well, is it's not just about the fighting, the friction, the families that support us. It's also about making tough decisions, being a leader, and knowing when the mission comes first and when to be lenient in some cases. So those lessons of leadership and overcoming adversity and how to manage people and personalities at times, that comes through, and that's applicable not only to our future generation of warfighters, but in the boardroom and corporate offices across the world.
You opened the book talking about the death of Libby, your squad leader, and that obviously draws in the reader so intensely. You talk about having to talk to his mother and the impact it had on you personally. I'm guessing even as gripping as it is in the book, it's hard to put into words what that's like.
Yeah, Corporal Libby was one of our squad leaders, and he died on December 6th in a grueling 5-hour firefight. It was one of the most complex and coordinated attacks we'd seen to date, and we'd only been in the city for a few weeks, although we'd experienced a lot of heavy fighting. When we got the news that Corporal Libby had been killed, it really did stun us, and it was the first loss, the first death we had in the entire battalion. And it happened to us. So it was not just shocking, but also sobering experiences. We lost one of our key leaders. And Libby was another one of those gregarious personalities that, I highlighted in the book. And there's just some people that stand out. Libby was one of them. And there were many others. But to say that I knew all of my Marines at that type of level, as I described, it wouldn't be true. I mean, there's some guys that just kind of hide under the radar. They don't want to hang out with the CO. They don't want to divulge or get too close or give too much away. But Libby was not that way. He was very outgoing, and he was a leader. And he understood that when bullets are flying and bombs are exploding, rank, age, and gender, or any of that, none of it comes into play. And he understood that very well. And that's why I trusted him so implicitly. And it was such a huge hit to not only me, but the entire company when we lost Libby, because everyone loved him. And when I had to make the phone call to his mom, I don't think there's a requirement to do it. I think every officer or leader gets some trivial class on how to write a condolence letter. But as I write in the book too, there's no training that can prepare you for it to do that. It's tough. Yeah, it's tough. But I felt that I owed Jenny Libby a phone call that night. And through the midst of everything, the fighting and the friction that night, when I took Libby to the aid station in my Humvee and turned him over to our first sergeant, our senior enlisted, Tom Foster, I knew he was in good hands, but I didn't know the outcome. But we knew it was bad. Then we've ultimately found out the news. That's when I decided to call his mom and talk to her. And, despite the painful experience that it was for me to make that phone call and even to talk about it, even though I do because I think it's important, the brightness that comes through that story that I want people to understand is that in all of her pain that day, hearing me tell her that her son was dead, the first thing that she said to me was, "Thank you." And I couldn't believe it. It literally stunned me to hear those words, come from Jenny, who was in Castle Rock, Maine, and I'd never met her, but she was a mom, and she knew that what we were doing in Iraq was hard work. She knew Dustin loved being a Marine more than anything, and she knew it was a miserable place that we were fighting in. And to hear her thank me for calling is indescribable. I mean, our Gold Star families are just a group of extraordinary people. There's no other way to describe them. They're not ordinary people. I don't know how you lose a son or daughter and then are still able to carry the torch and shine light for all of us who are still fighting. And even though we lost a brother that day, they lost their son. And then I had to make that same phone call again to his brother and to his dad on that same night. And it was very tough. But it's something that, again, I don't think that receiving a letter in the mail is how I would want to find out about it. I owed him more than that, and it was important to me.
You also talk about Blue Star families, devoting an entire chapter to the Downing family and the dad and the two sons that were all Marines.
I don't think most Americans can realize, and these are things that were peeled back when I started doing the interviews. At the time, I knew Ryan Downing, who was one of my young Marines, troublemaker. I knew it from the day I met him, but I loved him. And he was a thin, wiry, scrappy kid who'd already seen more than his share of combat during the first Battle of Ramadi. And when he got injured for the second time in Iraq, and I had to call his mom that he'd been medevaced out of country, she picked up the phone and we talked. And it wasn't until a little bit into the conversation that I found out that not only was her son Ryan in Iraq, her son Justin was also in Iraq, and her husband Jeff was in Iraq, all at the same time. She had all three of her Marines, all three of her men fighting in Iraq at the same time. And again, just blown away when she told me, "Thank you for calling." None of my Marines commanders have ever taken the time to call me. And all three of them had gotten injured at one point or another. Justin was blown up in a convoy explosion and received his first Purple Heart at the age of 18 or 19. Ryan Downing, my Marine, was already on his second Purple Heart. And just the Blue Star families, and they're an amazing organization too, because it's not just the guys fighting that you see on TV and that are deployed and get a little bit of coverage. That you multiply that times 4 or 5 on the people that they leave behind every time they deploy, and I think it's staggering. And my story's kind of out there for people to know through media and TV, and it was even on Fox News when I left my wife pregnant in our driveway in Virginia in 2004, 8 months pregnant, and said, good luck with that. And the first time I saw my daughter was on Fox News when she was born. And then I redeployed after a 10-month deployment and met my daughter for the first time, and she was 5 months old. But there's families that are left behind, and I think that's important, is that there's so many second and third order effects. And to be successful in the military is largely dependent on what we do. I mean, it was largely dependent on my wife, who supported me as independent as she was, for raising my daughter Bailey in my absence after so many deployments, and so many deployments that were extended. Normally it's 6 or 7 months, but for whatever reason I had this curse of being extended for 9, 10 months at a time, which was just based off the needs of the mission. So Kimberly Downing and her entire family, I want to say thank you to them again for not only sharing their story, but raising a great generation of warriors. I mean, these families that, I say it euphemistically, but that breed these young men and women to serve in our nation's military, they really are the finest people.
Just a few minutes left with Scott Huesing, author of Echo in Ramadi, and just do want to get back to a little bit of the tactical in Ramadi, given that it was so, it's urban warfare, and it's not typical warfare. It's asymmetric, I guess was the term often used. Was there a general strategy? Did it depend on the specific mission of the day? How did you go about, whether it's house to house or other different threats out there, about how you confronted them?
Well, again, fighting an asymmetric war where literally you're living amongst the people, you're living in the city, the front line is everywhere, the enemy wears no uniform, they blend in well with the locals. And at that time, we weren't fighting strategies or policy. We were fighting the enemy. And our mission was to kill or capture anti-Iraqi forces. And again, we were extremely effective. Our mission was pretty simple. And it was a little bit where the art meets science and vice versa, as we conducted clearance operations in the city. And through our technology, we're extremely effective. I mean, we had advanced weaponry, we had advanced optics, night vision devices, thermal optics. So we owned the night. So that's when we went out to hunt. And we pursued the enemy, constantly knocking them back on their heels as we moved through block after block, house after house, room after room, clearing every single thing out of that city. And I had a strict policy. And some of the Marines didn't like it, but it wasn't an option for them. Whenever they went into any structure, I made them take every single weapon out and carry it out. Now, that may seem like an easy task, picking up weapons and taking them out of houses for insurgents that are hiding them there as weapons caches. But now you're talking about an individual Marine who's already carrying about 45 to 60 pounds of gear, water, ammunition, his own rifle, and now he's picking up 2-3 extra rifles that weigh maybe 8 to 10 pounds each. He's throwing them on his back, and then to get caught in another firefight, it becomes a significant emotional event. Trust me. It's cumbersome, and that's where I describe it as this friction, this indescribable friction that can only be felt by those that have been subjected to that type of pressure under those circumstances. So we did this day in and day out, clearing inch by inch of the city and leaving nothing untouched. And around every corner was a squad of Marines, and if the insurgents wanted to come out and fight that day, it wound up being a bad day for them. We wound up pushing west, working for another task force, and I tell this story in the book because I think it's kind of funny, but we checked in, and it was an armored task force. They asked me how I was going to move around the city, how many vehicles I want. I said, none. They said, well, how many Bradleys do you want? I said, none. How many APCs? None. He said, well, how are you going to get around the city, Scott? I said, we're going to walk. I said, we're going to walk through every single street, every single house. And again, if there's an insurgent that wants to pop his head out around the corner, he's going to run into one of my squad of Marines, and it's going to be a bad day because we crawled through that city like cockroaches when the lights were turned on, and my Marines were engaging and killing the enemy every single day. And the way they did it was not only with lethality, because they're the most deadly weapons on the battlefield as individual Marines, and how straight they shoot their rifles, but they do it under such an immense pressure, but they do it with honor as well. And I was always impressed with the way they conducted themselves on the battlefield. And that was part of their training going in too. And I made that abundantly clear as before we were thrust into the city of Ramadi, is I told them that that's what they're going to have to do. You will have to kill. And I always wanted them to know that it was coming from me, so they could do that and never hesitate when it came down to making that one conscious decision, that singular movement of squeezing the trigger on that rifle and taking another human life, which is a horrific and life-changing event for an 18-year-old kid. I wanted him to know that I was ordering them to kill, because that's what Marines do. They follow orders. And at the end of this war, at the end of the battles, I wanted them to leave that place with a clean heart. And to get them to understand that, I think, was important. And it was, again, validated by those 50 combat vets that had been in the first battle of Ramadi. My salty, seasoned vets of now 22 years old. That's how seasoned they were. But regardless, they performed phenomenally each and every time.
And I think that's another thing that you do a great job of getting across in this book. In fact, I think you say it right there in the beginning of the prologue, is that if your idea of combat is Hollywood or is somehow glamorous, let me disabuse you of that right now. And then, of course, as you go throughout the book, it becomes abundantly obvious. But given the fact that it's a small percentage of families that are now connected to the military on active duty, how important is it for the rest of us to understand that it's not what Hollywood or anybody else would have us believe, but it's actually what you describe it to be?
I think it's important for listeners and anyone to understand, especially those in communities that aren't close to a military base, that aren't close to military organizations, middle America, that are kind of removed from it other than what they see on TV. And I did try to describe it in such granularity and detail so that it really paints a picture for the reader in Echo and Ramadi of what it's like, not only the surroundings, but what the people look like and what they felt. And I think it's important so they really understand the sacrifice that these young warriors made, and the sacrifices of the families, and the loss of our Gold Star families, because they didn't take an oath. They didn't get a vote. We did. And the fact that they lost a son or daughter throughout this long war, that's something they have to live with their entire lives. We can live with what we lost and what we sacrificed because we chose that. We made that decision. So I think that's important, and I think that readers will get a different inside look, because that's why this just isn't another war story. It's about the people, and it's about the feeling and this emotion that comes through. It's not about one sniper or a team of Navy SEALs. It's about 250 Marines and soldiers and sailors and their families and friends and interpreters and all of these great, citizen warriors that stepped up to help us fight, win, and survive in what was the deadliest city of Iraq in 2006. It's just really something different. And again, Greg, it's my honor to be able to share the story with you and be able to write it and share it with everybody.
Last question. I know you've also started an organization to help veterans or perhaps even active duty struggling to cope with some of what they've been through now that they're home. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm also the executive director of SaveTheBrave.org. It's a nonprofit, certified nonprofit that was actually started by one of my young Marines, one of my young warfighters in Echo Company, who just wanted a way to help veterans connect. And he asked me to come on board and help grow the organization several years ago, and we've been doing great things, helping hundreds of vets, because we think that there's no better medicine, no vaccine or pill that the VA or doctors can give that's really any better than connecting veterans so they can share their stories, because military personnel only make up less than 1/2 of the American population. Over 330 million people in this country, less than 1/2. within that, there's the Marine Corps. Within that, there's the infantry. Within the infantry, there's those guys like my Marines and Echo Company who were in combat, and those that were in combat squeezed the trigger on the rifle, had to make those life and death decisions. So when they start to unpack those traumatic events, those life-changing events, there's a very limited audience with which they can share. So I think it's important to have another organization in place where we can provide them a safe environment to share their stories, know they're always protected, and if they do need more help, we have a great network of resource providers that we vector those young guys to. And it's not just Marines, it's any veteran. And we screen them all through the veteran centers to make sure we're getting the right people to the right programs who need help. And I think that's important. And a portion of the proceeds of Echo and Ramadi will be donated to SaveTheBrave.org because I'm committed to it. And I wouldn't have it on the inside of the cover of the book if I wasn't. And I think if you give first, good things follow. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book as well. It's just helping vets. It just makes me feel good at the beginning and end of every day.
SaveTheBrave.org is where folks can learn more. Major Huesing, thanks so much for your service to our country, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Hey, thanks. It was my pleasure being on the show.
Retired U.S. Marine Corps Infantry Major Scott Huesing. He is also a veteran of Operations Desert Storm and Enduring Freedom, in addition to Iraqi Freedom. And the book, once again, Echo in Ramadi, the first-hand story of U.S. Marines in Iraq's deadliest city. I'm Greg Corombos. This is Veterans Chronicles.